Do you have a history of knee issues? There's one critical fact that most people don't understand about their knees that by understanding may help to resolve a lot of what you're experiencing with your knee issues. On this week's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, that's exactly what we're discussing. We're going to cue our introduction and we're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios and Muscle Activation Schaumburg, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset. And the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie.
And today we are diving into the knees. And there's one thing that I have seen time and time again over the last 15 or so years that people consistently misunderstand about their knees. And the reason why this is so important is because once you understand this aspect of your knees, if you're having knee issues, you can start to make your exercise decisions differently. And you can start to implement what we're going to talk about today to help make sure that your knees as a whole are getting stronger without stressing the areas that may actually be kind of contributing to the issues that you're experiencing. So that is what we are diving into with you today.
That's right. And I think that growing up, this knee thing that we're going to talk about was one of the most common things that I saw, especially, I don't know if it's the same with guys, but I know girls are like especially susceptible to like knee issues in a different way than guys are. But I had so many of my dancer teammates that wore knee braces, specifically ones with that little cutout that holds your kneecap. You guys have seen those, right? You can probably get them like at CVS and Walgreens and whatever, and you can also get like fancier ones. And I had so many of my teammates wearing them because they had this issue. And I hope that after today's podcast, you will approach this issue very differently, because holding the kneecap in place can potentially help in one specific way, but there's a lot of other ways that this can help. Now, the issue we're talking about today is not actually what is traditionally thought of as the knee joint. So if you look down at your leg, and what most people think of your knee is the thing that like bends and straightens, right? Like your tibia will bend or go back behind you and straighten out. And that is a relationship. The joint is between your thigh bone or your femur and your shin bone, which is your tibia. So that is the knee joint that we traditionally think about. And a lot of times we think about rehabbing all things that hurt near the knee, like you're rehabbing or strengthening the knee. But the issue that we're talking about today is actually a different relationship, and it's called the patellofemoral joint. And so that is actually the relationship, the joint between the patella, which is your kneecap, which is a small bone, and your femur. So it's the joint that describes the relationship between your kneecap and your thigh bone. And it happens right near the knee, but it's actually its own little thing. It can be trained, and the situation there is different than just what's strictly at the knee joint.
Exactly, and there are different motions that happen there than at the knee, and so there are different considerations that need to be taken when we're talking about an issue or something going on with that patellofemoral joint versus with the knee itself. But like you said, Julie, so many people kind of group them together and say, oh, there's an issue with my knee. And I'll ask, okay, well, where are you feeling it? And they'll point like right to the kneecap. And like, okay, well, that's not the knee. That's actually the patellofemoral joint. And like we said, that has distinct considerations that need to be taken in order to make sure that not only we're not stressing the area more than it should be stressed, but we are kind of proactively taking steps to possibly identify and clear up some of the other stuff that might be going on that's leading to the symptom in that patellofemoral area or around that kneecap, okay? So one thing that needs to be taken into consideration when we're talking about patellofemoral stuff is the position of the thigh bone or the position of the femur itself. That's going to be that groove that the kneecap or the patella slides in, it rides in, okay? And so a lot of times when we're talking about kind of like tracking issues with the patella, we're saying, okay, well, the patella itself is not kind of sliding in the groove of the femur as it is supposed to. And a lot of times the focus then gets put on the patella itself, but what we need to realize is there's a lot that can be done with the positioning of the groove via the positioning of the femur, and that is often done through the joint that, or one of the prominent joints of the femur, which is the hip. You know, you go up up the body to the top of the femur, and that is going to be your hip joint there. And so a lot of times what we see is actually by getting the muscles of the hip functioning better, getting the muscles of the hip stronger, and oftentimes getting the hip itself moving better, that is better, that allows the femur to be better positioned, which allows the groove to be better positioned, i.e. the track that the patella is supposed to be riding in gets to be better positioned. And then a lot of times those tracking issues, they aren't issues anymore.
Charlie, you bring up such a good point. For your patellofemoral joint to feel asymptomatic, which is what we want all joints to feel like, we don't want to actually feel our joints all that much. For it to feel good, this tracking relationship has to be spot on. There is a groove in the femur or the thigh bone where this bone is supposed to ride. And because the patella is smaller than the femur is giant bone, patella is tiny bone, we always think like, oh, well, the patella must be wrong. Like we should just push it over. But actually the patella has some of the strongest muscles in your body pulling through it. So even though it's a small bone, it is very tightly regulated, like where it is. It's not like it's just floating in some muscles or in some viscera and we just push it over, blow it over or something. No, there's like your quads pull through the patella. And so those quads are very strong muscles. So the place where your patella is, I'm not saying it's exactly where it needs to be, but it's not the whole story, right? And so what Charlie's saying is like, hey, we can change the position of the patella, and we're going to get to that, what you can do about that. But we also have to consider like, hey, the track that patella is riding in is also changeable. We never really think about that because it's connected to this giant femur bone. But one of I think the easiest places to strengthen, the place that we work on all the time with MET, is the hip. And so when you change the strength, the stability, your mobility, your ability to handle forces through your hip, you change your femur because the hip is the pelvis and the femur coming together. So when you change that muscular situation, then the bottom of the femur now changes. And even the slightest internal or external slight rotation that happens in the femur will change the direction or the positioning of that track, which is what the patella rides in. So if you're having a patellofemoral issue, the first thing that we always think of is, okay, we got to look at the hip first, because we know that the patellofemoral joint is a relationship between the femur bone and the patella, and the biggest bone and easiest one to change will be that femur bone. So changing where that track is it angled this way, or is it centered up? That's the first place that we often start diving into when looking at patellofemoral issues.
That's exactly right. Now, the second thing that you need to know about your patella is that right underneath your patella, or like inferior to your patella, is your patellar tendon, okay? And this connects your patella to your tibia, all right? And so when we are talking about, making sure that your patella is in the right place, that it is tracking correctly, you can also think about what might influence and control the position of your tibia, which would then put force through your patellar tendon and then kind of yank on your patella differently, okay? So a lot of the muscles that control your tibia and the position of your tibia also control the position of your ankles and the position of your feet. And so what we see is by working through the muscles that control the ankles, working through the muscles that control the feet, this helps that position of the tibia be more aligned with how it is supposed to be when you're walking, when you're running, when you're jumping, when you're doing your activities, which again will put different stresses through that patellar tendon and then different stresses up into the patella itself. So the ankles, the feet, that's kind of the next area that we see have a big influence, not only on how the patella itself is moving, but on how that patellofemoral area is feeling.
Definitely, Charlie. When you think about the positioning of the tibia, the first thing, which is that lower shin bone, the first thing you got to be thinking about is your foot and your foot muscles. Of course, we're always thinking about muscles because we're here, doing muscles all day long. But so if you think about your foot on the ground, and if you wanted to try this, you can smush your arch down and notice how there's like a chain reaction that goes up your leg. Like you can't smush your arch down and nothing else happen. You're going to notice that your tibia kind of angles in and rotates in a little bit. It's your shin bone. You're going to notice your knees kind of like knock knee a little bit. You're going to bend your knees a little bit. And of course, there's extremes of these and not very extremes of these. But this is just to highlight the relationship. So because it has such a chain reaction, especially on that lower limb, if your muscles of your feet are not functioning properly, the muscles that's supposed to support arches, that are supposed to make arches flexible and also stiff, and your toes function properly, and all the motions of your feet and all the muscles of your feet, they're not functioning properly, every time you hit the ground, which happens every time you step, then you're going to have a chain reaction going up your leg. And ideally, you want that chain reaction to be very supportive of other joints. If the muscles of the feet and ankles that are supposed to be controlling this area are not functioning properly, or are weak, or are failing, they're not functioning properly, they're not strong enough, whatever it is, and it sends a force up into the chain that is less than ideal, it is highly likely that you're going to feel it in a lot of other joints. One of the joints we see this in is that patellofemoral joint. So you're going to feel, because of the change in relationship of the patella in that femoral groove, gets kind of funky when the feet aren't well supported because that base is not being properly supported. So if the tibia is not functioning properly, which is the area below the patellofemoral joint, it is definitely going to kind of get that relationship weird, and that's when you're going to start getting symptoms in and under that patella or in the front of the knee there. So really make sure you're thinking about also not just the hip, but now the feet and how the foot muscles are controlling the leg too.
That's exactly right. Now, a lot of times traditional therapies just focus on the patella itself. Say, okay, well, it's not like the knee itself, it is the patella, and so the patellofemoral joint. And so the focus tends to be on trying to get the patella moving in the groove, the way the groove is aligned on the femur, and get it quote unquote tracking better, or get it stabilized using the braces like you were talking about at the beginning, Julie. But the other consideration is, well, maybe we need to make sure that that groove itself is positioned the way that would be easiest for the patella to slide through. Here in the Chicagoland area, it's like every winter there are more and more and more potholes that come up, right? And so you could say, well, if you're driving home and you keep hitting potholes, maybe what you need to do is you just need to start swerving all the potholes, which would kind of be like, hey, we need to, get better at driving the car. We need to get that, patella tracking, around the potholes, get it tracking better so there's not as many issues. Or you could go and fill the potholes and smooth out the road, and you don't have to worry about, swerving and everything that's happening there, which would be like making sure that track is positioned in the way that it is supposed to be positioned, okay? The groove on the femur, and also considering how the tibia is moving and aligned. And so when it comes to issues and symptoms that somebody's experiencing with the patella, what we see time and again and have for nearly a decade and a half is that when you consider what's going on with the hips and the muscles of the hips, and when you consider what's going on with the ankles and feet and the muscles of the ankles and feet, a lot of times what somebody is experiencing at that patella, around their knee, with that patellofemoral joint, those symptoms change dramatically for the better, okay? They have a dramatic better improvement than just trying to focus on the patella itself, because yes, you can make sure that the patella is sliding the way it's supposed to slide, but if the track, if the femur continues to not be positioned the way it needs to be positioned, then there's going to continuously be this tracking issue that comes up. It doesn't really have much to do with the patella itself. It has more to do with how the femur is positioned, what's going on with the hip, and oftentimes what's going on with the ankles and the feet.
Charlie, that is spot on. The way we normally approach this tracking issue is truly a tracking issue. How well is the patella tracking in the femoral groove? And we're saying, hey, no one ever checks the femoral groove. Like, we got to get the underneath, the foundation, the base on track first. But it is possible that you might be having a tracking problem, meaning you need to strengthen the direction and the way that forces are going through the patella. But there is a giant muscle group that we cannot ignore that pulls and directs and puts forces through the patella and kind of directs what the patella is going to be doing, and that is your entire chunk of quad. So your quads all connect to various points on your femur or on your thigh bone. One crosses the hip, but most are just on the thigh, and then they all kind of feed right into the patella, and then that patella then feeds right into your tibia, like we talked about. So it is possible, though, that you have weakness in your quads that is pulling your patella from one side to the other, or just not in its proper place, right? So it is important to also acknowledge, hey, we might actually have to treat this like a tracking problem, meaning we got to get the patella getting pulled into the right position. Now the quads, remember, they are one of the strongest muscles in your body. There are so many divisions of your quads, some on the side, some right down the middle, some deep, some more superior, some on the inner thigh area. So they're kind of pulling from all directions. And in the end, when they're all pulling properly, then they'll all kind of be pulling straight up, kind of up your leg, basically is what the thought is. But if one side or the inside or the outside, if one of those are failing, is not working properly, is not strengthened properly, or maybe there's been an injury there, then it might start happening that the patella is actually getting pulled off track, and it's a patella problem. So then that's when our focus then needs to come towards the quads. And the most effective way to start getting the quads to pull more effectively is just getting some good MAT, really. We do train on the floor with exercise, getting quads, but I will say it's probably one of the more difficult areas to target with machine work, or even, home workout style. Definitely home workout style is really hard because you don't have a specific quad machine. But if you do have a knee extension machine, you can play with that, trying to do different internal or external rotation with the tibia, trying to bias the ins or outs of the quads. But in the end, all the quads do need to be strong and firing, and there needs to be balance in them so that the patella is not getting pulled to one side or the other, which would take it then off track.
Exactly. I mean, one of the beautiful things about MAT is we're going to look at actually 11 different muscles for your quads. Not just you think, oh, quads, that's 4 muscles or just one group of muscle. No, we're looking at 11 different muscles for your quads with MAT. And that's one of the distinct differences between attacking something from an MAT perspective and attacking something from a general exercise perspective. Is you're able to get way, way, way more detailed, and you get to see, okay, exactly which parts of your quadriceps are not working the way they're supposed to work, which ones are compensating, which ones are having to overwork, and why are they having to overwork, what areas of your body are underworking, whether it's something in the feet, whether it's the hamstrings, whether it's something in the hips, or even something in the trunk. And you're able to evaluate that and say, okay, based on this, this assessment that we do with MAT, these are the different areas of your body that are underworking and causing your quadriceps to pull weird or pull more than they should have to, which is then creating this symptom around the patellofemoral joint, which you're calling a knee issue, okay? And so that really is one of the most powerful things about MAT, is being able to get that detailed with everything. So yes, from a quadricep perspective, we need to make sure that first and foremost they can contract, they can fire, they can do so correctly when they're supposed to, putting the right tension at the right time through the patella so that patella can move in the way that it's supposed to move. And then in addition to that, we need to make sure that the same things are happening with the muscles of the hips and the muscles of the ankles and feet, to make sure that the femur is positioned correctly and to make sure that the tibia is positioned correctly. So the groove that the patella will ride in on the femur can be optimal for it to slide through it, and so that the patellar tendon, which again attaches to the tibia, can be lined up properly. So with the tibia being lined up properly, and then putting the correct forces through the patella itself, okay? And so all of this we're really able to easily identify and address with the MAT process. And then once we're able to identify and address it with the MAT process, find the muscles that are lagging behind, find the muscles that are overworking, the ones that are compensating, and the ones that are not doing enough, and get everything up to speed, that's when you can start to go to the floor and do more traditional exercise and do more traditional strength training work for it to build up the endurance, build up the strength, build up the force production capabilities of the tissue, while making sure still from an MAT perspective that everything is still contracting well, that communication between the nervous system and the muscles is strong, and that everything is firing as it is supposed to.
That's right. I think a lot of people don't realize that when we're thinking about muscle strength and using muscle strength to make our joints feel better and work better and function better, there's two components here. Number one, the muscles have to be firing properly and getting proper communication from the nervous system. And number two, you have to build their tolerance. And so the thing that we always think of, which happens all the time in physical therapy, happens when you do the YouTube corrective videos, when you work out at the gym, all the traditional exercise that you're doing with weights and things like that, those are all building the resiliency, building the conditioning, which is necessary for joints to feel good. But the other part that you can't use if it's not functioning properly, you can't strengthen them if they're not functioning properly, is this connection piece, right? So if there's muscles that are offline, they're not connected well to the nervous system, they don't know to fire. They don't know to contract when you're doing your squat or your quad extensions or whatever you're doing. And so they can't participate in that conditioning step, which is necessary, but you need to have all the muscles functioning properly. So that's where the MAT piece comes in. So if you've been doing all the stuff, to do the strengthening and the building up resiliency and the conditioning of all the areas that we're talking about, the hips, then you have to strengthen the knees, the quads, the feet. You're doing even foot exercises too. If you're still not seeing the changes that you're hoping to see, it's very likely a connection issue, a neuromuscular issue. And honestly, if you're having symptoms, we've never seen it not be a neuromuscular issue. So that's where the MAT piece comes in. So make sure you find your local MAT specialist, reach out to us, and make sure that the muscles are available to support this joint. And then you go and you can strengthen the muscles and strengthen the motions once everything is available to be strengthened.
Exactly. So all you have to do to get on our schedule, see our availability for MAT, is go to www.matschaumburg.com. There's a big green button that says Get Started. You can click that, and again, you can see our calendar, what times we have open. You can schedule yourself for your initial consultation and assessment. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that has been struggling with some knee things and they have been doing all the traditional stuff? Maybe they have been told that it's actually a patella issue, that they are doing the tracking thing, they're using the braces and everything like that, but it's still not resolving. There still seems to be something going on, and it's keeping them from doing the activities that they want to do. Share this episode with them so they can understand the role that the groove plays in what they may be experiencing, the role that the hip may play in what they're experiencing, the role that their feet and ankles may play in what they're experiencing, and so they can understand the steps that they need to take to try to get those areas addressed. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us and leave us a rating and review. Not only does it help people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise, it helps them find our podcast when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us that 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.